Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast. Part 1 comes for free. You can listen to Part 2 by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. The decision to charge for the second half comes from our desire to maintain our independence.
I've been told also that the wet market phenomenon is very much a southern Chinese phenomenon, that the sale of wildlife, live wildlife, in markets is a Guangzhou, Guangdong phenomenon, not a Hubei, Hainan phenomenon. Yes, you do get a little bit of it in further north, but the main practice has always been down south, and also in neighbouring Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia.
Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast, an Irish home for independent journalism with a global perspective. The prophetess Cassandra advised her fellow Trojans to reject the horse the Greeks had seemingly left behind as a gift, but was ignored. Our Cassandra Voices podcast offers cautionary tales and inspiring narratives to illuminate our own troubled times. We'll be putting out regular episodes reflecting the broad scope of our magazine's coverage over the last 6 years. Thanks to the Loafing Heroes and especially Bartholomew Ryan for the use of their track Ro Goira from the 2019 album Meander Tales.
I'm Luke Sheehan. The very cave you're afraid to enter turns out to be the source of what you are looking for. Matt Ridley, the guest in this episode, is a science writer, a former member of the House of Lords, and author of works like The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves. With co-author Alina Chan, a molecular biologist at MIT and Harvard, Ridley wrote Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. Published in 2021, it is probably the most in-depth book on the question of the origins of the pandemic virus to date. It concludes that some form of lab origin is more likely, and Matt has become more convinced that this is the case in the intervening years. Chapter 1 of Viral opens with the epigraph I have just read. It's from Joseph Campbell, the great writer on myth and human development, and it's well chosen, as following the threads of the pandemic's start seems to lead inevitably back to China, to Wuhan, to the obscure workings of rulers in Beijing, and ultimately to the other end of the country, to the tropical forests bordering Laos and Burma. The opening of Viral goes on. In the spring of 2012, 6 men were admitted to a hospital in Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province in southwest China. As these men became sick, and in some cases died from COVID-like symptoms, attention would turn to an abandoned copper mine in Mojang County, where they had been harvesting bat guano. From here, Viral brings the reader into the world of cutting-edge virology, of sampling and experimenting with pathogens drawn from the wild. The Wuhan Institute of Virology's researchers moved in on Mojang and collected from there what would be, until the discovery of a closer relative in Laos in 2021, the closest known relative of SARS-CoV-2. In the past, I lived in China. In an online essay for Lilliput Press in 2021, I recalled a time when I explored those same areas, working for a volunteer organisation placing teachers in poor communities. Only a few kilometres from Mojang, I ended up crossing the border into Laos on foot and going down into Thailand from there. At some point, I joined a tour group that travelled to a bat cave to witness the colony waking up at sunset, to travel to the forest to feed. Among the many enlightening things one can learn from a reading of Viral is that, among mammals, only bats and human beings live in congregations of millions, making them ideal reservoirs for viruses. One thinks here also of the incredibly rapid spread of Chinese urbanization, the build-up of cities like Shenzhen and Wuhan, and the scattering of airports and connections across these centres, and of the pace of the eruption of the virus in 2020. I wrote as follows: they were coming from a blade-shaped gap in the rocks near the crest of the hill. The wings made a whirring and buzzing phrase. Their squeaking existed somewhere behind the scene in a vanishing state, coming at us from far away, the buzzing and the black shapes flickering past the sunset, the Thai sunset, which was pink, would have made you think of TV static if you were old enough to remember. Please enjoy this conversation with Matt Ridley in its entirety by subscribing to us to support our work. Thank you. Matt Ridley, thank you for talking to Cassandra Voices.
Luke, it's great to talk to you. And I'm particularly keen to pick your brains as well as let you pick mine, because you know China well. You've lived there. You've lived in rural areas as well as urban areas, I think. And you would understand how it all works. And one of my questions for you is, if there had been a laboratory leak and the authorities in the laboratory or in the local government knew this, would they have been likely to admit it in the early days of the pandemic?
Absolutely not. I think you can, first of all, thank you for being complimentary about my insights. I think I have some insight that people who have excellent command of Chinese language, who study their politics. I went there as a kind of copywriter. I worked in several industries and I got my adventures in. So in that sense, I'm standing over my experience. I saw quite a bit of the country, saw inside a few different kinds of types of companies, and was exposed quite a lot to their industrial political sort of culture, as it were. No, I think that once it would have become obvious how incredibly serious the outbreak was, I think the drive to repress the outbreak itself and any information pertaining to it would have been immediate. I think you can also maybe add two things. One was that while we do look at China correctly as relying on very strict hierarchies of power now consolidated in the leader, many experienced people have gone and looked and said, well, you know, it's what that size of a country moving at that speed, they do actually have to, in a sense, give autonomy to many layers of industry and politics. A recent interview I listened to with a French man, François Morin, who's essentially the leader of French-Chinese nuclear partnership, laid out very clearly how, you know, it's not as if every major decision in nuclear is sent back up to Beijing and ratified there. In fact, they give different regions of the country a certain amount of autonomy. And so there's a disconnect. I think you would have seen, you can look back at the early days of the outbreak and see how maybe the local officials, whenever we believe it started, were probably trying desperately to contain it. And the truth, the best truth, maybe didn't filter back up to Beijing until after, in a sense, it was too late. That's possible, that disconnect came into play.
Yeah, interestingly on that point, there's a new book by Dali Yang, who's a Chinese-born professor in Chicago, which has investigated the early days of the pandemic in some detail and using mainly Chinese sources. And it goes into some considerable detail about how the municipal authorities in Wuhan responded, how the hospitals responded, and places an enormous amount of the blame on these local responses. There was a desire not to rock the boat with Wuhan's municipal boosterism following the World Military Games in October 2019, and exemplified in the fact that one of the doctors, Dr. Ai Fen, who blew the whistle in the hospital saying, hang on, there's something bad happening. There's a lot of people presenting with pneumonia of unknown etiology. She was subjected to a severe rebuke, which specifically said, you are spoiling Wuhan's reputation here. And then the mistake was made by these authorities in assuming it was an animal infection, a zoonosis, and therefore that you could only catch it from an animal, not from a human being. That was the official position of not only the Chinese government, but also the World Health Organization right up until the 18th of January. Now, I think Dali Yang's book lets Beijing off the hook, rather, by putting so much blame locally. But I think he's not wrong in the sense that there is a tendency in these very authoritarian regimes for local government to do what pleases central government without central government having to tell them to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the days of Mao and the state-precipitated famines, and people would be sometimes sent into him or sent into whoever, a higher authority, and they would say, well, you know, give me your figures. And they learned pretty quickly that they had to simply confirm figures. that were desirable. Meanwhile, the food just wasn't there. So the people at the very bottom would have to face that reality. So I think there's a good deal of that. I think the way that pressure is also applied in China, it's interesting. It works to do with their hyper acceleration as well. Because if America, say, and some Western centers of power economy can be arguably said to have worse bureaucracy and red tape than China. China, where you can have a company like Xiaomi, which has gone from making phones, literally in the time I lived there, it was a new phone maker, competing with Apple, and now it's making electric cars and has a vast automated factory. You don't get this kind of acceleration if you bind people with red tape. The habit of China has been to let things go extremely fast, and then if something goes wrong or they want to adjust, they lean back in and just they can just tell the executive that you're restructuring your company, like they did to Jack Ma. And what they do, the euphemism, is called having a cup of tea. When the authorities suggest to you, we'd like to see you for a cup of tea, it can be like you just have a cup of tea and they explain to you certain things. We don't like you said this and we want you to change your mood here. Or you could disappear for days or weeks or a longer time. And certain executives, probably Jack Ma, probably others, we've had financial crises, nearly the collapse of a real estate company, Evergrande, recently. So if you do something that will anger, the top levels, they're going to ask you for a cup of tea. And usually when you come back and you've been encouraged to completely change your outlook, and you will have changed. Someone like Ai Fei, that whistleblowing doctor, she then came back, I think in March or April, and made a video on her Weibo saying actually everything is fine in Wuhan and there's particularly nothing wrong with this Institute of Virology. And so they do things in that way. And, it can be quite successful in persuading people to step into line. Of course, the leverage classically that is used, and they do it with dissidents, is to say, well, what about your family? We know where all of them are. You might want to think about them. And
right.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, there's been a paper published today, an analysis done in Canada of all the genomes of the early viruses and comparing them with the bat viruses, which argues that there was some kind of recombination event. They imply in the paper that it must have been a natural one, but actually it's just as compatible with the idea that it was in a lab between different bat viruses, which enabled the SARS-CoV-2 to emerge in the human species by jumping species. And they put a date on it. They say it was sometime between August and the end of October 2019, and most likely around the end of September, the beginning of October. Now, that's fascinating because it's way earlier than previous estimates. Most other estimates, the Chinese position has been that this started in December 2019, even though they themselves had cases from November that were leaked to the South China Morning Post, which they later denied. But if it really was true that sometime around September, October, there was some kind of an accident in the laboratory or some natural event that resulted in people getting infected, and that it was a very slow burn phenomenon throughout October and November before exploding in December, particularly when it got to that market, then it means all the Western arguments that the market must be where it started are wrong, because the market explosion comes much, much later in the story. And it also puts the focus back on the fact that they took their virus database offline on the 12th of September and never brought it back online, that they ordered new ventilation equipment, that they had some kind of a dressing down from party officials in that lab in September about biosafety. So it's showing a picture of significant lack of transparency by the regime, both centrally and locally, in the autumn of 2019, that simply wouldn't have happened in any other country and wouldn't have been tolerated by the World Health Organization in any other country, and indeed wasn't tolerated by the World Health Organization in 2002-03 when the SARS epidemic happened. Gro Harlem Brundtland, the head of the WHO at that time, reprimanded the Chinese government significantly for failing to be more open about it. And they did respond by being more open about it and promised to do so again in the future. But here's a case where clearly they weren't open about it in the autumn of 2019. Clearly, they weren't open about it even in January of 2020. And we just don't know what to believe about what did or didn't happen in those months. So that's why talking to someone new who understands China is important for someone like me.
Well, I understand it, of course, as a foreigner through frames, and there's connections to be made just by reading widely. So I'm interested to learn more recently about the French connection to the lab. I was somewhat aware of it. I ended up working a little bit for a French-founded multinational which was making high-tech hospitals, and I discovered that these employers of mine, they had actually helped to build the emergency build prefab hospital in Wuhan that went around as a propaganda success for the Chinese. Look how quickly we built a hospital. But of course, that rapidity, that speed, is kind of part of the problem, as well as the kind of habit of opacity, doing things without the transparency, and also use what was sometimes called the dual use in this case, which has like a very specific meaning. But to me, it reflects a lot of Chinese industry, where you basically you can pretty much be guaranteed, if you go to China and set up a factory to make product A, someone will be using the model, the blueprints, or even the raw materials to do something else. There's a hell of a lot of that, a hell of a lot of kind of grey industry that goes on. This case, the French, as far back as after the...
Sorry, that's just before we get on to the French, that's that dual-use point, a very interesting one.
Yes.
Because the virology work being done on SARS-like viruses by Xi Jinping's group at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was very much a catch-up with American work, and eventually an overtaking of it. So Ralph Barrick at University of North Carolina developed this system for working with coronaviruses using reverse genetics, where you basically reconstruct a virus from a DNA copy of a synthetic genome and then turn it into an RNA genome and try and grow a live virus out of it with a particular manipulated sequence in the genome. And in order to get access to that technology, what seems to have happened is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology accepted significant funding from the US through the EcoHealth Alliance, and then collaborated with Ralph Barrick's lab on a famous paper that was published in 2015, in which essentially the deal is Barrick gets access to all these coronaviruses which are only found in China, because Rhinolophus bats and therefore sarbecoviruses only live in the old world. They don't live in the Americas. But the Chinese in turn get access to the techniques of virus genome construction and manipulation that are being developed in Ralph Barrick's lab. And by 2018, the two are collaborating with the EcoHealth Alliance on a plan to ask for money to do a whole series of even more sophisticated experiments involving the infection of these viruses into humanized mice and so on. It doesn't get funded by the Pentagon, but the same group gather together again to talk about funding from the US and also, we think, from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And that work probably went ahead in 2018, 2019. So it's quite a good example of exactly what you say of a rapid Chinese catch-up with a technology developed elsewhere, and then an ability to do it on their own.
And 2015 coincides really effectively with the onlining of the BSL-4 capability of the lab there, which had been under construction for really a long time. According to what I read, this goes through several French presidencies, and the French presidencies are long. So they set up the deal, and they're trying to go through with it. They're hoping the Chinese will play ball. Bernard Cazeneuve gets, I think, over to Wuhan, says, we're going to have loads of 50 French scientists here, and they were never allowed to set foot in the place. Next thing, it's time to collaborate with North Carolina and go and take thousands, I think, of samples of bats from that region of China. Those things confirm it in my mind, or at least lead, the bloody footprints keep accumulating, leading back towards this lab whose doors are closed. And indicators for me, just the sheer volume, of the sampling going on, the constant reaching down into that jungle region where I lived, which was so different. I mean, I guess a simple cosmetic aesthetic point I just want to make is just, having been there, it is utterly different. It is a world away environmentally and culturally and physically from those industrial northern cities. It couldn't be more different. I was walking around these poor village areas with just massive biodiversity and very wild people who were scratching out a living in little banana farms and things like this. So yeah, utterly different. And then you have these scientists coming over and over and over again, accumulating all of these samples, doing lots of important work.
Really want to come back to that, but just a very quick point on the French collaboration. And then let's get back to this, the Yunnan jungles, as it were. The lab that was built with French expertise and collaboration was the biosafety level 4 lab, and that was China's first BSL 4 lab. That, as far as we know, was not used for any of the experiments that may have been risky with sarbecoviruses, because they talk quite openly about doing the experiments at biosafety level 2,
yes,
which is inappropriately low safety level, and biosafety level 3 for the mouse experiments. And so in that sense, you might say it's not relevant. But what is relevant is the disillusionment of the French with the failure of the collaboration to work as intended, the failure to allow them to be present in the lab and continue the experiments, the disillusionment of the French with the corner cutting in the development of the lab, the lack of training and expertise, identified also by a team from the US Embassy, which visited Wuhan to write a report on the biosafety level 4 lab. The reason for them doing that was because the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston had been involved in advising the project as well. So they were able to say, we need to come and check on this work. And they came back saying the procedures, the training, and the facilities are not operating at a safe level. Now, that's a pretty serious report. And that comes in 2018, just before the pandemic. Now, if that's happening in the BSL 4 lab, how do we know it's not happening in the BSL 2 and 3 labs as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not about kind of constantly trying to confirm indicators of sinister behavior or anything like this. But, you know, another China point, as it were, could be if you just simply look at something undisputed, which is that you have this sensitive because new state-sponsored lab, which is creating applications that are going to DARPA. And then you think that the Chinese military won't be all over that. I mean, forget it. I mean, whatever how you interpret this scientific arrangement, I do understand the desire to get access to that biodiversity and those samples, and the need for scientists to continue to talk to each other if possible. I mean, that's all very real. But if you think that some communication is going on to, you know, the Pentagon's R&D wing, and the Chinese military aren't going to be very, very interested and perhaps run their own parallel kind of exploitation of it, then you don't get the country, I'm afraid. They'd be very,
well,
very
we know that
interested.
People's Liberation Army researchers were involved in the Wuhan Institute of Virology as well.
What you are listening to has taken time and resources to prepare. It is a collaboration of committed journalists. Please, if you can, share, subscribe, or support this podcast in whatever way you can.
Can I bring you back to Yunnan? Because I'm very interested in this. I spent a lot of time trying to understand the area from which the closest relative of SARS-CoV-2 at the start of the pandemic came. That's the RATG13 sample from the Mojiang area of southern Yunnan. And trying to, I spent time poring over satellite maps and trying to understand what kind of country we're talking about, because it's not far from where they'd found the cave with the most likely antecedents of the SARS-1 virus, as well, the so-called Chitu cave. And so clearly this is the area, southern Yunnan, where there is a huge diversity of Rhinolophus horseshoe bats. They are carrying large numbers of SARS-like beta coronaviruses, sarbecoviruses, in a way that they don't where they live further north. They'd sampled Hubei province around Wuhan, 10,000 bats had been sampled there, and they'd never found a sarbecovirus in them. Found other coronaviruses, but not sarbecoviruses. So clearly there is a huge focus from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in this area, which is 1,800 miles away by car. It's a long way from Wuhan. And it's a very mountainous area. I think very limestone-ish, if I'm right, but very forested. And one of the things that intrigued me from the satellite maps was how much, as it were, uncultivated forest land there is there. And then I checked, found that there'd been a lot of reforestation as people have been leaving rural areas. A lot of tea plantations, fruit plantations, things like that, had rubber plantations had reverted to secondary forest. Which rather gives the lie to the idea that it's human encroachment on natural habitats that may be the problem here. But just talk me through what villages are like in these actually ethnically semi-autonomous areas too, in southern Yunnan.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it came to me as something of a surprise. I was volunteering for an organization that sent people out to sort of benefit villages that have been depopulated. You have a situation in China that's quite general. The previous place I had been was in a deindustrialized area in Jiangxi province, completely different, where there are empty factories and people are poor. In this case, down in the jungle, a similar situation, just the adults have left, and you often end up with, older people and babies living in villages. And that was specifically the problem that this charity startup was addressing, to send people out there to just educate and help them out, make them feel less alone, and reconnect them to their distributed families who might now be living as workers off in the big cities. So they're upfront about this problem. They know that there's a kind of a rural depopulation and impoverishment going on, and that's what I was doing. I was sent to Xishuangbanna without being, this is typical China. Nobody explained to me that I was going there until like the day before. Suddenly I'm on a plane. I'm in this jungle. I'm in a car with a guy driving for maybe 4 hours up through these winding roads to get to the village where I was. And he tells me on the way that the place is known for cannibalism. And that's his little joke. But, it was not anymore, but it's a wild area. And you can't kind of underline that enough. You're talking about real mountainy village kind of life and tribal cultures.
Yunnan province?
It's Yunnan province, and it's an area called Xishuangbanna, which is effectively, I think, it either contains Mojiang or it's right beside it. Yunnan province is large. Like when you get the miners, for instance, who are helicoptered or sent off to hospital, in that story that opens your book, were sent to Kunming. But then again, that's a couple of hours flight away.
Long way away.
Yeah. So that's urbanized. It's another big city. But this area, Xishuangbanna, it's up into the highland jungles. It's continuous, with northern Laos and with that part of Thailand, although there it starts to kind of flatten out. But up in those mountains, it's really quite wild. And, I was like greeted when I came to my school with a completely bisected and chopped up cow that they were burning with a flamethrower. And then I was told it was a greeting, like a kind of, a little offering for my arrival. And I spent the next 2 weeks just eating parts of this cow. Every single bit of it would appear in bowls. And I'd be talking to the headmaster of the school, who was drinking baijiu most of the day. And doing a bit of teaching too with these kids. But it was it was really quite wild and quite different. And you could feel the biodiversity heavily when I went to walk in the jungle, which people didn't think I should have done. Any trace of you that you left would immediately have insects swarming all over it. And I hadn't realized how much of a kind of Chinese rainforest, Chinese Amazon it really was. So unsurprising then that you get viruses and you get other things spilling out of all of that biodiversity. And incredible to note that it might actually be reforesting, getting wilder, as it were.
Yeah. How fascinating. And you didn't happen to stumble upon anybody shoveling bat guano out of a disused copper mine or anything relevant like that?
No. But bats, I had suggestions of bats. And in other trips I took when I've been to northern Thailand before, and they will take you off to see bat caves to see the emergence of bats. They're like one organism coming out of a giant cave. Extraordinary to note biologically there, how you do in your book, that only bats are like us and live in congregations of millions of organisms. And that's a biological fact that we should pause over, because now you have megacities like the Chinese megacities connected to other megacities with low-cost flights. And, the ingredients are there for a big spread.
You say you were in an area that's bordered with Laos. Laos is a very mysterious and difficult country to work in. It turned out a year and a bit into the pandemic that the closest relative to SARS-CoV-2, the virus, was actually found in the summer of 2020 in a bat cave in Laos. Now, that seemed to exonerate the Chinese end of the issue, perhaps, but it quickly became clear that the EcoHealth Alliance had been working in Laos and had been sending viruses to Wuhan from there because of their collaboration with Wuhan. And indeed, the Pasteur Institute project, which found that virus, was working with a local partner, which was very closely connected with China. So it's not at all impossible. Well, in fact, we know that viruses were being transported from Laos to Wuhan, as well as from Yunnan to Wuhan. So what is the Laos government like? What is the relationship between China and Laos?
I would share that I crossed the border on foot into Laos just for the fun of it. I'd finished my volunteering. I said, there's the border. Someone can drive me to the border town and I'll just walk across and then start traveling from there. And I was on my way to Thailand. And what you had was something like, Jurassic Park, where they're in
you
the
crossed into Laos and didn't come back. I mean, you crossed Laos in order to travel on from there.
It was 2016. I went off to Thailand and then I ended up journeying around Thailand and then eventually went back to China to carry on with my life the following autumn. This is how I spent that summer. But the difference and the feeling of the border was extreme. I didn't expect this. I thought you might go and there's a guard. No, it was a kind of militarized concrete barrier jumping up over the jungle with a big kind of airlock you pass through, and you're got guards with a couple of guards that are probably armed, and a kind of watchtower. And then I walked, there's a border area which was completely overgrown, obviously, because no one can really go there, kind of no man's land. And there was a ruined temple in it, monkeys everywhere, and just very rich kind of bush. And then you got to the Laotian side, and it's completely different. They have no money. They have a wooden shack, and all the police had gold teeth and gold chains. And then you had to kind of, unlike the Chinese side where it's digital, the Laotian side is they're writing on little bits of paper and you basically pay them what felt like a bribe, or, you hand over cash and then you get to enter the country. So there's an extreme difference of development, and their country is...
From there you traveled to Vientiane, or...
I didn't. I just bypassed it. I took taxis through the country. I saw a bit of the river, met some people, and then I crossed the border again into Thailand, where again there was a difference. The Thais having a little bit more development, more tourism. So Laos is known for its relative lack of development. It's landlocked. It has very little kind of leverage and doesn't attract tourism as much. For that reason, some people love it because it's considered more authentic in some ways. Other people will go there and find it way too raw and rough. And what was obvious as well is that in these border areas, people don't understand about this. It's a kind of hidden world. One phenomenon of note is that this area sometimes gets called roughly the Golden Triangle, where there's a huge amount of contraband, especially heroin, that gets traded in and out, and sometimes the Mekong River. You have part of Myanmar, Borneo, and then you have the Laotian borderlands, really, that are key for China. In Chinese terms, these are kind of less so much Lao, more so now Borneo, but you have a very, very rough kind of territory there where effectively some of the Chinese gangster element, the Chinese mafia, have turfed up and kind of overtaken the kind of border with Myanmar, because there you have a civil war. The ingredients of a civil war, which predated the current fighting, just show you how undermined the state is there.
You said Borneo, I think you meant Burma.
Burma. Yeah.
It was a translation of Myanmar. But yeah, I understood what you meant. So Chinese influence in those areas across the border is both official and unofficial. In other words, sort of Chinese gangs as well as Chinese relationships. So is it beyond the? There's been somebody speculating recently on Twitter that the viruses that the Pasteur Institute found in Laos, which turned out to be quite closely related to SARS-CoV-2, might even have been planted in the lab in Laos, where by Chinese agents keen to suggest a non-Chinese source of the pandemic. Now, that would be if the laboratory facilities in Laos were fairly primitive, fairly easily penetrated, etc., or dependent on Chinese aid in some ways. Does that feel at all plausible to you, or is this going too far in terms of suggesting what might have happened?
There's a certain level where I feel like I should pause insofar as speculating about specifically how intelligence interacts with high-level science in this way. Is just remarkable to me. I mean, even trying to watch the American intelligence agencies supposedly grapple with this problem, supposedly share their findings, disagree with each other, and then at a certain moment you're wondering, is the scientific capability as strong as they claim, or as it might be? And there's huge arguments in the COVID origins and COVID debates about the relative scientific capacity of one person over another to comment. But I would imagine that it's
very well put. Yeah.
It's remarkable that, okay, you have all this pressure. There's obviously a dynamic where we want to find out exactly what happened in China. And then suddenly, lo and behold, something that seems like very useful proof turns up where? In Laos. It's just discovered there. And it's external to China, no matter what the source of it is, whether it's a lab or a zoonosis. It can't happen in China, right? We've seen that pattern from the beginning, where even people who most promote the market theory won't have their own findings amplified in China at all. They won't even have them discussed, and they don't have any seemingly don't have any problem with this. It's like, well, the exotic animal trade, as it did in 2003, has thrown us into a catastrophe, and you don't want to go and pursue any reform. You don't want to throw a spotlight on this trade. What's the story there? So yeah, it seems to me like it might not be a coincidence that it turns up in Laos, but it still begs the question: how did this thing, which is there in bats in a jungle across a border in a completely different world, turn up in Wuhan? It's highly unlikely that you get an exotic animal which is infectious, infects no one, is transported across the whole country, turns up in a market, and then spits out the most virulent coronavirus we've ever seen.
Which happens to be very well adapted to infecting human beings, of course, as well.
Yeah.
I've been told also that the wet market phenomenon is very much a southern Chinese phenomenon. That the sale of live wildlife in markets is a Guangzhou, Guangdong phenomenon, not a Hubei, Hainan phenomenon. Yes, you do get a little bit of it in further north, but the main practice has always been down south, and also in neighboring Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Does that fit with your experience? Very
much so. I mean, Chinese food culture is a kind of religious one, and indeed it overlaps with spiritual beliefs, with beliefs about medicine and health and the body, ideas which China has tried to have kind of approved and ratified by the WHO that come out of Chinese medicine. The distinction between gastronomy and medicine, very different, if it even exists. So you have like gastronomical adventures and experiences, but you also maybe have really deep kind of beliefs about the benefits of potential properties of different creatures. But those things are really, really strong in, surprise, surprise, the most tropical kind of area of the country, where you have access to this kind of biodiversity to pull very strange creatures out of the ground or out of the air and then make recipes out of them. And the Guangzhou is utterly famous for this. When you read about the specific recipe for civet cats that might have led to the pandemic, or sorry, not the epidemic in 2003, and you're just aghast looking at what this thing is. This kind of bizarre thing that's like a soup that involves a civet cat and then a snake and some other things, and they want to.
Yeah, there was this thing called tiger serpent soup or something.
Yeah,
it had some specific
it's
name.
very well. It's very well known for it. I mean, traveling through, I've been to Guangzhou and Hong Kong, but they have so much trouble with people trafficking exotic animals in their suitcases that you have like warning displays in the railway and airport in Hong Kong and Guangzhou, like with the different animals that you shouldn't be trying to drag through as bushmeat in your suitcase or alive.
So if a zoonosis of this kind was to happen, it would be much more likely to happen, as it did in the case of SARS, in Hong Kong or Guangzhou rather than in Wuhan.
Completely, and that's and that's the logic followed by, I think, the EcoHealth Alliance collaborations, by the WIV itself, and it was what everybody involved in this kind of research expected. Hence, they were going to those areas. So that makes...
They were specifically saying, and indeed Xi Zhengli said this to Scientific American in the early days of the pandemic, I never expected it to happen here. I expected it to happen in southern China.
Right.
And we're talking big distances. I mean, we're talking the difference between, London and Rome or something like that, aren't we?
Yes, it's
Yunnan.
It's true that China is becoming more interconnected all the time, and yet that was specific why I personally felt such an enormous difference to suddenly crop up in a place like that, because it didn't feel like taking the high-speed train from Shanghai to Beijing, or the classic conduits that connect China and do so in a very deep way, from canals now through to trains and motorways and plane routes. It's a country that leans heavily towards its eastern coast and this kind of orientation with Beijing, Shanghai, and then an interior up the Yangtze River to Chongqing, and that's kind of the core. And then Xinjiang, Tibet, and I would hazard maybe these kind of jungle areas are sort of stuck on. They are remote, and the process of connecting them into the main arteries has been gradual. And you don't have the same arteries. You have an airport in Xishuangbanna, but you definitely don't have massive high-speed trains leading up and down there at all. And so
well, the difference between New York City and Montana, or Dublin and Connemara, perhaps.
We don't have that. We a lot of our deep wilderness and biodiversity internally, I think, in Ireland is long gone. And we were proud of, say, in our ancient history of oak forests, and the only oak forest, big one we have left, is our national park in Killarney. But it turns out that those are transplanted American oaks. So we're a heavily kind of husbanded and agricultural society, which doesn't have this savage edge and this feeling of jungle, which is exactly what I experienced and was so shocking to me. I remember going to the nearest local town, mini city, and there was an ATM, and there was a lizard using the ATM like a pond. It was attracting insects, and it was living like in symbiosis with the ATM. The bugs would come in, and it was just picking the bugs off. So it was, that's not the same as Shanghai or Beijing at all. And then you have those border territories, places like Laos and all of that. They're obviously all viruses, and bats and things won't respect these borders. So anything that you find in northern Laos, you're gonna have the same thing in the bats in China for sure. So if those viruses are out there, and every indicator seems to be that the pandemic comes from that biodiversity down there. That makes total sense.
There were brave attempts by one or two journalists, particularly John Sudworth of the BBC, to get to the very copper mine where the RATG13 virus came from and where those miners got sick in 2012, and very much prevented by a combination of sort of locals not collaborating and police turning him back and roadblocks and things like that. So the reach of the central government can be there if necessary in these remote areas.
Yeah, and notably I think in viral as well, picking up on another detail after a French documentary crew, and I think maybe NBC, they all tried to get in close to that mine, and then someone spoke to a local, and he said, well, they've blocked up the entrance and covered it in CCTV cameras in the jungle. So yeah, they obviously set out an alarm. And why are they so specifically afraid of John Sudworth getting to a cave full of guano? I mean, it's what's he going to do there? Take guano away and bring it back to the BBC headquarters? I don't know. But, it's that kind of second guessing, that kind of criminology. I tried to give it a name, although the Beijing equivalent is Zhongnanhai, and it doesn't roll off the tongue, Zhongnanhaiology, but it is like...
Very nice.
Yeah, it's trying to figure out what is going on, and if you have such extreme reactions, you may infer that something is up. And I think that's fair to argue at this stage. And when I follow the arguments of senior esteemed virologists who are really endlessly trying to stick the knife once and for all into this kind of theory or way of thinking, it seems to me like they just simply want to exclude all political journalistic, personal, anecdotal, cultural evidence. None of it is real apart from this data set that I have that suits my theory, and the rest simply doesn't count as evidence. And I don't accept that, because I lived in that country. I was there for the start of the lockdowns. We thought, first of all, I will get through this. It'll be like 2003. Then we went, they're shutting down the entire country now, and we've got to get the hell out.
To listen to the remainder of this podcast and access bonus material into the future, please consider supporting us with a subscription.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Cassandra Voices is a multimedia project that seeks to highlight independent voices and inspire original thinking with stories from Ireland and around the world. Go to CassandraVoices.com online to read more and look out for more episodes from us in future. Your attention and your support are crucial. Thank you.